All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be diving into something that might sound a little academic, but stick with me because I think it's got some really interesting implications. We're going to be talking about qualitative assertions and this idea of whether qualitative research can offer anything sort of like prescriptive statements. And the reason you should care about this is that it gives you a better understanding of how to interpret and value different kinds of knowledge, different kinds of evidence, not just in specific fields like education, but really just across the board.
Yeah, absolutely. And the source we have for this deep dive is a really intriguing article called Qualitative Assertions as Prescriptive Statements that really tries to get at this question of, what kind of claims can qualitative research make and how strong can those claims be?
Yeah, so that's kind of our mission today. What are these qualitative assertions? How are they different from the kind of conclusions you might see in a more numbers-driven quantitative study? And when, if ever, can qualitative research actually provide, like, guidance, real insight, something you can use to make decisions? By the end of this, I'm hoping we can equip you, the listener, with a more sophisticated understanding of how to approach different kinds of research. So let's just jump right in. When qualitative researchers present their findings, what do they typically offer?
Well, typically qualitative research doesn't come out and make direct prescriptive statements, things like you should do X. It's more about presenting asserted outcomes that are grounded in a transparent research process.
Okay, transparent in what sense? Like, what does that look like in practice?
Yeah, so it means being explicit about the research design, the theoretical framework being used, how participants were identified, the data collection and analysis techniques, really being upfront about the whole research journey.
I see. It's like, here's the path we took, and here's what we learned in this particular context. And how does that differ from how quantitative research usually draws its conclusions?
Right. In quantitative research, you're often evaluating evidence based on statistical measures, power, effect size, sample size, to make these probabilistic claims about what's likely true for a larger population.
Right, like p-values, statistical significance.
Uh,
So qualitative research, then, it focuses more on this rigorous process rather than statistical strength. And that leads to a common question, which the article addresses. How much is enough?
yeah, exactly. How much data? How much theory? How much involvement should the researcher have? How many alternative explanations should they consider? And as the article points out, the answer is always, it depends. It depends on the specific context of the research.
So it's not that qualitative research is just this free-for-all, right? There's actually quite a bit of structure to it.
Oh, absolutely. It's not about just throwing things at the wall and seeing what sticks. There's a ton of rigor in qualitative research. And the article talks about how one of the main differences between the two approaches, quantitative and qualitative, is how they operationalize persuasive evidence.
Okay, so unpack that a little bit. How does persuasive evidence work in qualitative research?
Well, think about it this way. Quantitative research often relies on this idea of statistical probability, the likelihood of a finding being due to chance. Qualitative research, on the other hand, often uses what's called an inductive approach. So instead of starting with a hypothesis and trying to falsify it with stats, they're building their claims from patterns in the data.
So instead of relying on those p-values, they're looking for themes, for those connections in the details.
Right, exactly. And it often uses this confirmatory approach where they're showing that their interpretation of the data or their hypothesis is better supported by the evidence than other possible explanations. And the strength of the claim then comes from this convergence of evidence that multiple sources of data point to a similar understanding.
Gotcha. So it's about the overall picture, the consistency across different pieces of the puzzle. And the article actually lays out 3 conditions that can give us more confidence in a qualitative claim. What are those?
Yeah, so the first one is just total transparency in the data analysis and reduction strategies. Researchers need to clearly articulate how they went from that initial raw data to the key findings they're presenting. And then second, the study needs to be grounded in the existing research literature. It shouldn't exist in a vacuum. It should be building upon, connecting with, and potentially even challenging what's already known in that field. And then the third one is that the researcher's role in relation to the research needs to be clearly articulated. Are they an active participant, a more detached observer, or something in between? This helps a reader understand any potential biases or influences that might have shaped the research process and the findings.
Makes sense. Knowing the researcher's perspective and how they engage with the study definitely influences how we interpret what they're saying. Now, the article also goes into the historical evolution of qualitative research. Why is it important to understand that history? when we're talking about its knowledge claims.
Right. So understanding that historical context helps us see how the field has evolved over time. And there have been, a bunch of different moments in qualitative research from the early days of anthropology, the development of more formalized research methodologies, periods of, kind of self-reflection about representation and power, and the diverse approaches we see today. But the fascinating thing is that despite these shifts in focus and those underlying philosophies, what has remained consistent throughout is this descriptive nature of qualitative research. It really relies on that narrative data, on words and images, to try to capture that richness and complexity of human experience.
I see. So even though how we think about and do qualitative research has changed, it's always come back to this detailed, the story-like approach.
Yes, exactly. And the article reminds us, quoting Sari Bicklin here, that qualitative researchers tend to approach the world in this nitpicking way, really paying attention to the little details. And this focus on thick description, as it's often called, is essential to what qualitative research brings to the table. It's about building a comprehensive and nuanced understanding, rather than isolating specific variables for statistical analysis.
I love that phrase, thick description. It really captures that idea of trying to grasp all those subtle layers of a situation, not just the obvious surface level stuff.
Exactly. And you can almost think of qualitative researchers as bricoleurs. They're skillfully using these various methods and theoretical perspectives and analytical tools to piece together a more complete and insightful understanding of their subject matter. So while it may seem less structured on the surface, there are these specific protocols and procedures that guide the different qualitative research designs, ensuring a focused and systematic approach.
Okay, so it's not just about making things up as you go along. It's a different kind of rigor. The article also talks about the importance of the philosophical and theoretical lenses in qualitative research. How do those things shape the process and ultimately the findings?
Yeah, these are fundamental. When researchers embark on a qualitative study, they're doing so with certain philosophical assumptions, whether they're explicitly aware of them or not. They have beliefs about the nature of reality, about how we come to know things, and about the role of values in the research process. And these beliefs, whether explicitly stated or not, really influence the kinds of questions they ask, the methods they choose, and how they interpret what they find.
So researchers, their worldview actually impacts how they go about doing their research.
Absolutely. And, the article even mentions Bogdan's idea that we have to unlearn some of our core assumptions about quantitative research when engaging in qualitative work. It requires a shift in thinking, a different vocabulary, a different way of structuring the inquiry.
Interesting. And how do the theoretical lenses fit into this?
So the theoretical framework acts as a kind of focusing mechanism. It helps the researcher identify potentially meaningful patterns in the data. Researchers who have a strong grasp of the relevant theory will be more likely to notice those key details and insights. But at the same time, they need to be careful not to let that pre-existing theoretical knowledge blind them to new or unexpected findings that might emerge from the field. And the theory also guides things like site selection, case selection, allowing for meaningful comparisons between different cases. And ultimately, the theoretical lens a researcher adopts is going to influence the language they use to describe their research and the choices they make in terms of methodology.
It's a real balancing act, then, between what you bring to the table and what you learn along the way. Let's talk more about transparency, something the article really emphasizes. Why is that such a huge deal in qualitative research?
Yeah, well, in qualitative research, we don't have those statistical tests and probability values to fall back on to bolster the confidence in the findings. So transparency becomes super important. The researcher needs to be really upfront about their methods, how they collected the data, how they analyzed it, and even their own positionality as the researcher. And this allows the reader to really understand how they reach their conclusions and to assess whether or not those conclusions are well supported by the evidence or if they're, just the researcher's opinion.
It's that show your work mentality, so the reader can really follow your logic. And how does this transparency play out in the nitty-gritty of data collection and analysis in qualitative research?
So a lot of times in qualitative research, you're doing this deep dive into a smaller number of cases rather than that broad but maybe shallower look at a large number of participants. And because data collection and analysis often happen kind of simultaneously, you're gathering data and starting to analyze it at the same time, the path from that raw data to the findings might seem less linear than in a quantitative study. But what qualitative researchers are really trying to provide is that rich, that intricate web of connections within and across the cases they're studying. And the strength of their assertions really comes from seeing those same patterns emerge from different sources, ideally using a variety of methods, what we call triangulation, to corroborate their interpretations and to really strengthen those claims.
Okay, triangulation. So like looking at something from multiple angles to get a more complete and accurate picture. And the article also mentions field work, and it specifically pushes back on this idea of the researcher as a blank slate.
Right, that idea that a researcher can just go into the field with absolutely no preconceptions is a myth. We all bring our own experiences and perspectives and frameworks of understanding into any situation. The key for qualitative researchers is to be really aware of those influences. That's what we call reflexivity. And to really try to capture the participants' own meanings and interpretations rather than just imposing our own.
It's not about striving for some pure objectivity then, but about recognizing your own subjectivity and how it might be shaping your understanding of what you're observing. And the fieldwork itself, the data collection, that's a really deliberate and planned process, right?
Absolutely. It's all about making those strategic decisions about who to talk to, what to observe, what kinds of documents or artifacts to collect and analyze. It's not just this willy-nilly random gathering of information. The research questions driving the study really need to be the guiding force behind the whole data collection strategy. And without that careful planning, you risk ending up with data that's either insufficient or irrelevant to the claims you're trying to make.
The article also mentions something called tacit knowledge. Can you explain what that is and why it's so important in qualitative research?
So, tacit knowledge refers to those unspoken, sometimes even unconscious understandings that people have. It's the knowledge that's embedded in their actions, in their silences, in those nonverbal cues, in their tone of voice, things that they might not even be able to articulate explicitly, but that really shape their behavior and their perspectives. And uncovering that kind of deep local knowledge is often key to developing those really credible and insightful explanations that qualitative research is known for.
Oh, interesting. It's like understanding the unwritten rules of a game or the unspoken norms of a culture. And the researcher's own experiences in the field, the challenges they faced or the decisions they made along the way, are those important to document and report.
Oh, absolutely. Being transparent about your own interactions with participants, any obstacles you encounter, and the reasoning behind the decisions you made throughout the process, that all helps the reader better understand the context of the research and to assess any potential biases or influences on the findings. And, keeping really detailed notes and memos can be super helpful for the researcher in this process, just clarifying their own thinking and the logic behind their interpretations.
Now, there's an interesting distinction the article makes between assertions and conclusions in qualitative research. What's the difference there?
Well, because qualitative research is often so deeply embedded in these specific contexts, focused on a particular moment in time or a particular set of experiences, it tends to offer assertions rather than definitive, universally applicable conclusions. Those findings are often seen as starting points for further conversation and exploration rather than, the last word on a topic. There's this inherent recognition that truth, whatever that means, can be really nuanced and dependent on the context.
So it's not about claiming to have found some absolute and unchanging truth, but those assertions, those claims, still need to be grounded in the data, right?
Absolutely. And a common pitfall the article mentions is not having sufficient evidence or not having enough variety in the evidence to really support the claims being made. It's not just about the quantity of data you collect, but whether that data actually serves as evidence to back up the assertions you're making. And that's where that careful alignment between the research questions and the data collection plan comes in, and that idea of triangulation we talked about earlier, drawing on multiple sources of data to really strengthen the claims. And validity or, trustworthiness in qualitative research isn't typically established through some predetermined statistical test. It emerges throughout the study, through the researcher's intentionality, their rigor, and their, reflective engagement with the entire research process.
And it's also important for researchers to actively seek out evidence that might actually challenge or contradict their emerging understanding, right?
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Actively seeking out and grappling with what we call disconfirming evidence is essential for making credible assertions. Researchers should really approach their own interpretations with a healthy dose of skepticism, actively looking for data that doesn't fit neatly into the emerging patterns they're seeing. And that process of analyzing both confirming and disconfirming evidence is what helps to refine the assertions and deepen the theoretical understanding, leading to more robust and trustworthy findings.
So the researcher obviously plays a huge role in building the case, but the reader also has a pretty significant responsibility when it comes to evaluating qualitative research, right?
Exactly. Because we don't have those statistical significance tests to rely on as a sort of shortcut for evaluating the findings, readers of qualitative research really need to be more actively engaged with the research report. It's really this joint responsibility between the researcher, who needs to provide that transparent and well-supported account of their process, and the reader, who needs to really think critically about the plausibility and persuasiveness of the researcher's argument. And this is sometimes called pragmatic validation, like, does this research make sense? Is it useful in a real-world context?
So as a reader, you're constantly asking yourself questions like, do I believe these people? Has the researcher considered other possible explanations? Do I understand their perspective and how that might have shaped their interpretation?
Exactly. That reader confidence in qualitative research is really built on those kinds of critical engagements with the text, looking for those markers of quality, like transparency, triangulation, in the absence of those clear-cut statistical signposts that we find in quantitative work. It's this active partnership where the reader is thinking along with the researcher and making their own judgments about the strength and credibility of the claims being made.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here about what qualitative research is and how it works. But let's circle back to that original question. When can qualitative research actually offer something like prescriptive guidance?
Yeah, and that's the million-dollar question, right? While most qualitative researchers are hesitant to say there should be one single set of standards for evaluation, there's definitely a commitment to high-quality work. And those values we talked about earlier, transparency in the data collection, transparency in the analysis, reflexivity on the part of the researcher, those are all key. They reflect the researcher's, I guess you could say, intentionality and skill in conducting and communicating their research.
So even if they're not giving you a list of rules, they can still provide some really valuable direction and insight.
Oh, for sure. Drawing on that in-depth contextual understanding, qualitative researchers can offer really nuanced suggestions about how their findings might be relevant for different groups. Maybe it's teachers in a particular type of classroom, maybe it's administrators facing a specific challenge, or policymakers grappling with a complex social issue. They can provide that kind of informed guidance about which settings or which groups might find the findings most pertinent. And they can even offer ways to assess how well those insights might apply to other situations beyond the original study's parameters.
So it's not about handing down commandments, but about providing well-supported insights and potential pathways for action.
Exactly. When you have that clearly articulated framework, a well-explained data plan, those carefully developed assertions that are grounded in the data, and then thoughtful suggestions about how the findings might be understood and applied, qualitative research can offer really valuable evidence to inform decision-making and to guide action, even if it doesn't necessarily lead to prescriptive statements in the same way that, some quantitative research might.
So to kind of sum it all up, qualitative research really provides this rich and contextualized understanding of these complex issues through transparent processes and well-supported assertions. It offers a different but equally valuable form of knowledge compared to those more quantitative approaches.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. And while qualitative research usually avoids those hard and fast prescriptions, it can offer really valuable insight and guidance when it's grounded in strong evidence, transparent methods, and, that careful consideration of the specific context.
That's a great overview. I think it really clarifies how to appreciate and value the unique contributions of qualitative research. And to you, the listener, I want to leave you with this thought. How might these principles of transparency and carefully building those assertions, things we've been talking about in the context of qualitative research, how might those apply to how you evaluate information in other parts of your life? What kind of evidence are you looking for, and how is that evidence presented? It's worth thinking about the different ways we create and validate knowledge, both in the world of research and in our everyday lives. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.